encourage your soul, enlighten your mind, and empower your faith. This is the Light Network. If you want to be a serious Bible student, a successful servant, and a powerful preacher, this is the podcast for you. Hello and welcome to Preachers in Training. My name is Robert Hatfield, and this is the podcast on which we discuss all things preaching and ministry. On this week's episode, Season 15, Episode 5 of Preachers in Training, we're discussing encouraging missionaries and foreign ministers. I'm excited about this discussion. It's, I think, a needed one, and one that I'm happy gives me a good excuse to reconnect with Ryan Davis, who is joining us today from Nashville, Tennessee, where he serves as the preaching minister for the Bellevue Church of Christ there in West Nashville, I think you said earlier before we hit the big red record button.
That's right.
Hey, brother, welcome. It's good to see you. How you doing today?
We're doing well, thanks. It's good to see you too, and we're excited to be working here in Nashville. But a big part of our heart is still in Cusco, Peru. And so I'm excited to be able to kind of tell a little bit about my experiences and in one specific context, and hopefully that'll provide some blessings for others.
Yeah, wonderful. Well, I am really excited to hear a little bit more about this. I enjoyed following the work that you all did, and others, of course, that were a part of the work there in Cusco, Peru, and a work that is ongoing, no doubt. But let's dive into this a little bit. And you've mentioned the location. Tell us about the work there in Peru and how you got involved with it.
Sure. Well, I can't take credit for getting involved in it, and that's a good thing. But my wife Sarah and I joined the work in Cusco in October of 2020. No, I'm sorry, we left in October of 2014, and we were there about 4 years after the original team members, a team of people from Freed Hardeman, the Kaiser family, the Reeves family, and then the Cook family. Matt is a professor at Freed Hardeman now, right? So they started the church in 2010, and so we kind of came in with another family as a second wave, and we were there to build on the foundation that had already been laid, and I think especially come down and to help guide the church towards some of the long-term sustainability that it was going to need after missionaries were gone. So focusing on reaching the lost, of course, but also in training local leaders to continue the work beyond, the presence of the foreign missionaries. And so, we kind of outlined the whole work around just some 5 goals that we tried to use as a framework to guide everything that we did. And so, of course, we wanted to reach the lost, but we also wanted to establish a local congregation that was big enough, like I said, to be self-sustaining, to where it could be financially self-sustaining, could have enough people in it that were being discipled that you could actually expect local leaders to be raised up from that group of people. And that was one of the biggest things that we focused on. Sarah and I did. She did Bible studies all day, every day, especially until our little boy was born. And I did a whole lot with trying to disciple men in the congregation for future leadership. We also, because it was Latin America and the physical presence of the church building is actually still a very important thing. Of course, that's the case in most places. We are hopefully nearing the end of the process of trying to help them get established in their own permanent location. That way they have a home base to be able to continue reaching out into the community. And then our goal, our prayer, is that they will also have the opportunity to start other church plants in the area. So we kind of had an ambitious set of goals there, and we'll talk about this, I'm sure, in a minute, but had a lot of successes, enjoyed a lot of things to celebrate, but there are also so many challenges, the kind of stuff that doesn't end up in the furlough talks, very much that you hear at churches. So, and I'll touch on that a little bit later whenever we get into a little bit more about the, missionary care and how to interact with your missionaries. But, and then just kind of those were the guiding principles of our work. But then we also always, as a team, had the mindset of we're not coming down there to live there permanently. And that temporary mentality in theory, gave us a sense of urgency to be doing what we were doing, and a sense of urgency not to do the ministry ourselves, but to train others to do it. That way, it would not be a codependency between the missionaries and the local congregation, but instead equipped men and women to carry on the work. And
Hmm.
so between 2018 and then 2020, it did not go exactly to plan, but we had missionary families that left kind of in a staggered way over that time period. And so as of right now, there are no foreign missionaries, no American missionaries there in Cusco. It's all local leaders.
Wow. That is really fascinating. One of the things that has always struck me about uh, the work there in Cusco was the planning of it all and the intentionality of it all. You know, everything you just described. We don't want this to be something that is continually led by foreign missionaries, but instead, go establish the work, put it in the hands of the local people there, and allow
Right.
for them to do that. By the way, as a sidebar note, you mentioned the Kaiser family a moment ago. We had Barton Kaiser on back in season 11, episode 10. Was Barton was one of the original team members, right?
Yes, he was. He was.
Okay. Yeah, awesome. And Barton was on. He briefly discussed a little bit about the work there in Cusco, and of course now he's laboring among the Spanish-speaking people in Charlotte, North Carolina.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
that was a neat episode. So I'll put that link in the show notes at thelightnetwork.tv for this episode, which is season 15, episode 5. But that'll point you back to season 11, episode 10 from back in March of 2020. Wow. How about that?
Yeah, so that was right as the pandemic was hitting everywhere, wasn't it?
Yeah, yeah. And I don't remember it being that time, but anyway,
Yeah,
these things happen. So backing up a little bit, what was it
sure.
that made you want to be a part of a work like this, to leave the United States? I don't know. Did you plan for your family to grow and your son to be born overseas? I mean, all of that stuff. What
Right.
was it that drew you there? And maybe if you want to go specifically to Cusco.
Sure. Well, God, first and
Hmm.
foremost, of course. And he did it in as he often does, in a way that I couldn't quite pinpoint in the moment. It was only in retrospect that I could see, how his hand guided the whole thing. But I graduated from Freed Hardeman in 2011, and then I went right into finance. I studied finance as well at Freed and went to work in finance. I was actually here in Nashville back in 2011, 2012. And but I was working kind of as a volunteer in the college and young adults ministry at Crieve Hall here in Nashville. And I just found myself over and over again just feeling drawn to ministry. I was one of those preacher's kid, told myself, no, I'm not going to go into full time ministry. I'm not,
Yeah.
famous last words, but I just kept feeling myself drawn more and more into ministry, even though on a volunteer basis. And it was right about that time that God kind of reconnected me to this really beautiful girl that I knew as an acquaintance in school at Freed Hardeman, but really never spent time in the same circles with her. And just so happens that my brother got a youth internship with her youth group over near Winston-Salem, North Carolina,
Hmm.
and we got reconnected that way and started talking. And I found out not too long after we started, talking long distance, that she was already in touch with the mission team in Cusco. She had gotten in touch with Matt Cook,
Mm.
and it was right after the team there had had a retreat the weekend before, and they had come to the conclusion that they needed a single girl to come join the team because they had so many women coming in for Bible studies. And
Oh,
so
wow.
um, long story short, I was already looking to get into ministry. A lot of things that the experiences God had given me before that really had opened my mind and heart to traveling. I mean, I went to Europe on the same trip that Emily, your wife, went on.
Yeah, that's
I had
right.
yeah, so we went all over Europe together, and then so I had that love of other cultures and traveling, and I grew up playing soccer, and so I had a lot of Latin American friends. And so, whenever I found out that this girl that I was falling in love with was heading to Cusco, Peru, and I was already feeling drawn to ministry, it was not a hard decision at that point. And so we headed down that way. And to answer your question, no, I had no clue that we would ever end up in Latin America, in Cusco, Peru, that I'd have a little boy over there, and none of it was planned, right?
Yeah, that's wonderful. Tell us about, the language. I mean, did you know Spanish going there?
I mean, as much as a boy in small town Middle Tennessee in high school Spanish knows Spanish, right? And
Yeah.
so they tell me that the base learning was kind of there, but we spent 2 hours a day, 5 days a week for about 9 months in private lessons in Cusco.
Wow.
And so that was just kind of going through the gauntlet, but we had a value on our team that we didn't believe that, ministry through translation was effective.
Mhm.
There's just, you might be able to communicate words, but you can't connect with hearts that way. You have to be able to speak in their language. And so before we even got involved in full-time ministry, we had to know the language pretty fluently. And so
Mm.
that was, it's one thing I would recommend. I know you're going to ask some of this stuff later, but that's one thing I would recommend for anybody considering going to the mission field is, uh, your job is to focus on learning the culture and the language before you go down. That's the only that's going to open up the pathways for God to be able to connect you to people.
Mm. What was it in your mind that made that work there in Cusco so rewarding to you,
Yeah.
during that time?
Well, the people in general, the local people, the people, at least in Cusco, Peru, they're incredibly warm and friendly. After you get to know them, they're a little bit standoffish at first. They're mountain folk, and so they're a little guarded.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, Cusco's at about 11,000 feet, so we're high up in the Andes Mountains down there.
You guys were
But
always posting pictures that were giving all of us wanderlust, you know? I mean, it was just you were in a beautiful place.
it's an incredible country, beautiful landscapes, beautiful people. It's one of the most well preserved, indigenous cultures in the world still today, and so very special, magical place. But really, it was, what initially drew us down there was some of the stuff you spoke to before, just
Mm,
the intentionality behind the work, and that core principle that we're down there to equip others, and then leave and go do it somewhere else.
mm,
Um, I will say that we were very thankful for the strategic planning that went into it. But in retrospect, I wish in a lot of ways that we had focused, or at least relied less on our planning and a lot more on prayer than we
mm,
did.
mm.
I think sometimes you can plan yourself out of God's plans, and so that's one thing in just retrospect. But incredible team of people to work with, and then just God opened a lot of doors for us. And again, I'm trying in all of the ways I'm wording things not to take any of the credit for it, because I feel like Cusco happened to me rather than the other way around.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, so you mentioned some challenges a minute ago, and these are the
Sure.
things that don't get into the furlough speeches. You know, everybody wants to talk about the great things that were happening, and no
Right,
doubt there
right.
were. That's not in any way to take away from that.
Sure.
What was most challenging to you as a missionary? And I'm assuming that whether you're in Cusco, Peru, or elsewhere, there's probably going to be some overlap, maybe in some of these
Sure.
challenges that you'll mention.
Sure. I mean, in our context, one of the as far as like reaching people, one of the biggest challenges, because I did not personally experience a whole lot of culture shock. They say a lot of people, once you hit that 6 month mark,
Mm,
you kind of hit a wall and you really start to miss home and all those kind of things. I never missed home, but some of the cultural differences were just frustrating for me, because we're very, intentional, time oriented,
mm.
North American mindset, Western mindset, and they are very much not that way. They're very much a relational people. You get there 30 minutes, 45 minutes late, you're early. You
Wow.
don't cut off a conversation with somebody to get to an appointment. All of those things that give, United States people conniptions, those were hard to adjust to, but they
Yeah.
taught us so much. about slowing down, about what's important, and about not, being enslaved to time and your schedule and some of
Hmm.
those things. But as far as what was challenging, I know that there are a lot of places, I'm thinking of mission reports I heard growing up in the church where you just hear, oh, there's so many baptisms and there's so many people and the gospel is just spreading and spreading and spreading. And we had a lot of baptisms. God blessed us with a lot of people. But that wasn't the hard part. The hard part was making sure that the roots were actually taking root, that it wasn't in
Mm.
shallow soil, and that people were actually committed to the decision they had made, and that they weren't just telling you what they thought that the missionary wanted to hear. And so a lot of people came in, and a lot of people also went other ways as well. And so that was challenging to um, feel as though the effort and the time you put into people, you just were continually praying that those people would stick around long enough for it to really take root and to really catch
Yeah.
the vision of what was going on there. So that was a struggle for us. And then just, I don't think I ever understood, and this is something that, we'll talk about a little bit more. Um, it's very easy to have a certain perception as a United States church member of those crazy people that are willing to go off to some other place and serve, and to put them on some kind of pedestal that they don't deserve to be on. Not that they're
Mm.
not wonderful people, but they're normal people just like
Hmm.
you. Ministers, missionaries, they're not, infused with some extra measure or double portion of the spirit or anything like that. We're regular people.
Yeah.
And so one thing that I fell into down there fairly easily was kind of starting to get my identity so wrapped up in the work and everything down there, and feeling like it all depended on me, on my
Mm.
planning, on my effort, my strategy, all of those kind of things. And so it's very easy to, I guess, feel the pressure of the whole thing depending on you, and that puts you in the place of God, which He never
Right.
intended you to be in. And so a lot of challenges and lessons learned through those kind of experiences too.
Yeah. There's a delicate balance here, right? And I think
Yeah,
all ministers and all people to some degree or another can relate and appreciate this. I mean, you have to you have to plan some, and you don't want to be
right.
reckless with time
No,
or whatever. But at the same time, yeah, you can overplan, and some of us are more type A than others of us, and then
that's
that
right.
that can turn into a bad thing, right?
Yeah,
All about perspective.
it is. It really
Mm.
is. And I think that that's one of the things that um, I would, encourage everybody to go down. It's easy as the missionary who has grown up with Jesus, has grown up with, all of the stuff in church and stuff, to go down
Hmm.
and think, focus so entirely on what you have to impart or to teach others,
Yeah.
and not be open for that to be a reciprocal relationship, and for the things that you're going to learn. And I don't mean just a cliche, oh, they taught me so much. I mean,
Hmm.
just really opening yourself up, evaluating, the good and the bad of your culture and your upbringing, and the good and the bad of, every culture, every society has its strong points and its downfalls. And so really allowing yourself to be influenced as well, by the good aspects of the culture that's receiving you. So,
Hmm. Mm. It can be so easy for preachers to just sort of live in their own heads and in their own worlds all the time, that it, we're trying to just churn out content or accrue Bible studies or
right,
whatever, and we're not really sharing ourselves and our lives with the people around us, and so we're not really meaningfully connecting with
right.
those people.
A lot of times we try to have that Superman armor on, and you
Hmm.
have a veneer of invincibility, but it's just that, it's a facade. And
Yeah.
allowing yourself to be vulnerable in a healthy way, of course,
Hmm.
with the people you're ministering to, is very powerful.
Aside from, and you mentioned, how you all work to overcome the language barriers. Um, did you find that vulnerability and all of that pretty well translated even across cultural lines and things like that?
Oh yeah, you show one little chink in the armor, and they'll just be like, "Aha, yes, yes." No,
Okay.
it did. And you do it in all sincerity. You don't have an angle with it. You're not
Yeah.
trying to, you know, oh, let me share a little bit about myself so that you'll just spill your beans, and all the things I know
Yes.
you need to say. It's
Right.
got to be a genuine thing, but yes, I mean there were differences in the cultures, but everyone is a child of God, created equally, and so we all have the same fundamental struggles. Do some cultures and people tend toward different temptations and struggles than others? Yes, but they're all
Mhm.
fundamentally, the same. And so, being able to identify with each other can really only happen, even cross culturally, if you're willing to go down and present yourself for who you actually are, which is an imperfect instrument to be
Mhm.
used, not a
Mhm.
somebody who's just God's gift to the people that He sent you to.
Right. Right. Um, yeah,
Yeah,
so many directions we could go in there, and I'm
right,
just gonna rein it in. Um, but to that end, it,
right.
it almost sounds like what you're saying is that whether you're laboring in Cusco, Peru, or in Nashville, Tennessee, fundamentally, and maybe even beyond just fundamentally, the work
Mhm.
is the same, and connecting with people is the same.
It is. You might change strategy, you might change approach, you might change, little nuances of yourself. I think that's what Paul was getting at when he became all things to all people. He
Hmm.
didn't change any of the core message of the gospel. He didn't change himself. He was the same Paul, no matter which church he was working with, whether he was in the synagogue or in a house church or whatever it was.
Hmm.
But
Hmm.
um, he was able to, really embody the fact that Scripture knows no cultural barriers and bounds. Ultimately, you just have to find the right way to connect with people.
Yeah. So let's talk about the COVID era of all of this for a while. I know that
Right.
flipped everything on its head, or turned it on its ear, whatever the phrase is,
Right.
for all of us in many ways. By the way, as a side note, I'm
Sure.
hesitant to use the term missionary because the technical side of my brain is saying, well, every Christian in one sense or another is a missionary, and usually we talk about missionaries, and from our perspective, it's the people who go someplace else.
Right. Right.
but uh, but anyway, and foreign ministers, by the way, I understand that it's all about your perspective and where you are.
Right.
Um, uh, how did it affect the work, accommodatively speaking, of you as a missionary at that time? You said you returned in what, October of 20?
We made the decision to kind of make our return a permanent one. We came
Hmm.
back in July of 2020, so beginning of
Okay,
August, really.
all
And
right.
so we had actually been in the United States for a handful of months on an extended trip in 2019. Got back to Peru, you know, ready, rejuvenated, raring to go at the beginning of February of 2020.
Oh wow. Okay.
Month and a half later, the world shuts down, and Peru had one of the strictest lockdowns, I think, in the Western Hemisphere.
Hmm.
And we
Hmm.
were battling it out for a long time with Belgium for highest mortality rate in the world from the virus. And so I know there were people that had it far more difficult than we did, but it felt
Sure.
hard. It felt
Mm.
hard where we were. And to the point, some of the things you were mentioning earlier, how you'd been hearing from different people, especially when the pandemic hit, from all over the world, not just from the United States, and how things were affecting them. It just think it just exposed a lot of, or maybe amplified a lot of the things missionaries go through normally. The
Hmm.
differences in culture, just being out of your familiar zone, just a general feel of not quite the same level of security or healthcare or welfare, and some of those kind of things that cause you to always kind of be living a little bit more on the edge of your comfort zone than if you were in your home area. But
Hmm.
then all of a sudden, something that was hadn't been seen since a century before hits, and it did change a lot of things. And
Hmm.
as it did in a lot of places, You couldn't minister in person. A lot of ministries were brought to a halt. One of the hallmarks of our members in Cusco was literally face to face going into communities and serving the poor, serving food, clothing, a lot of things like that, benevolence projects. And whenever a people that is not used to doing church by computer, not used to doing a whole lot of business by computer still, is forced to do everything by computer all of a sudden, I mean, it was an unexpected hit for the church there as well. And I
Mm.
know that can be broadly said about most places in the world, if not all, but just speaking from our context, it was tough on all of us. And I think for those of us who are foreign missionaries, especially, I can speak to, it forced us to have a lot of conversations, hard conversations about the future that we weren't ready to have yet.
Mm.
Um, Sarah and I and our little boy Luke, we were planning on being in Peru for probably 4+ more years
Oh,
at that time. And now, whether that was God's plan or not, that's another issue, but it
right.
forced us to, I guess, distinguish between those more. Because it's very easy whenever you go down and you've got this plan for how things are going to go, and you almost project your plans onto God's and say, "Oh yeah, these are our plans, therefore those must be God's." If we're just
Hmm.
receiving blessings from the fruit of our plans, but then to flip that on its head or turn it on its ear, whatever the phrase is, uh, I still don't know. Um, but for us to all of a sudden have to really sit there and say, locked in our house, just had a team meeting via Zoom that morning.
Hmm.
Does God want us here? How could God not want us here? How could God not want us to stay with this fledgling church?
Hmm.
How could God possibly be calling us back to the United States where there are a lot of churches, a lot more Christians, and it starts to kind of shake your ideas on things, and how much exposes how much maybe of your identity you placed in your work, which that can be anybody can place their
Right.
identity in their work. I think it's especially a temptation for ministers and missionaries,
Hmm.
because you project that higher calling onto things, um, even though in God's eyes all work done for His glory is valuable work. And
Yeah.
so it made us have a lot of those conversations. We had a couple of our families that were still on our team, foreign missionaries, that decided to leave right as the pandemic began. We were there for about 6 months during the lockdown. Um, but I mean, it took a toll. And I know that our missionary organization, Great Cities Missions out of Dallas, they provided a lot of care for us. But I can even remember a couple of the Zoom calls that were supposed to just give us a platform to talk about stuff. They didn't know how to handle this either. They had
Yeah.
never been through this. They had never had to offer that level of care to anybody, or that type of care. So, um, and I'll cut off here in a second and rein it back in myself. But I think that one of the things that, kind of the blessing within the difficulty down there, and I'm still trying to kind of retrospectively, kind of continue processing, what was God's hand and what wasn't, and all those things. But one of the things that I think came out of it as a blessing, not without its challenges, was that us having to have those hard conversations about, oh my goodness, is this when we're going to be leaving
Huh.
the field? We were the last American couple on the team. We had a couple of other single girls that were still with us on the team at that time, but we were the last family left on the team, and so it kind of felt like our departure meant the departure of missionary presence in general for the most part, and so it felt
Mm.
like it had this extra weight to it. Um, but I think what the pandemic did, and forcing our hand to have some of these hard conversations and times in prayer and fasting and everything, was it helped us to see that maybe the Cusco church was ready for us not to be there anymore.
Mm.
Um, I know I could easily look back and say, oh, the decision that we made to come back, Oh yeah, that was probably because they didn't need us here anymore. It's easy to just kind of justify things, but we spent a lot of time in prayer about it, and it's not been without challenges to the work there since then. Barton and I are continuing to provide a lot of support for the church there. The Estes Church there in Henderson is
Hmm.
overseeing our two evangelists there, and so I'm still working with Estes on a regular basis, but it felt like it was one of those situations where, over the course of the pandemic, a lot of the dependency that the church members had on the foreign missionaries had shifted, even without us knowing that it had happened so much,
Mm.
to the
Hmm.
local leaders, which is exactly what you need.
Yeah.
And so God worked that around that way. And that's been a hard transition. It's still ongoing for them and for us, but
Hmm.
I think it helped us to see that there is a point in a church planting missionary's life where you can overstay, not overstay your welcome because you'll always be welcomed, but overstay your effectiveness and overstay your need and create that dependency or that ongoing dependency rather than,
Mm.
all right, baby birds, it's time to be pushed out of the nest and fly.
Yeah. And I think about, what Paul said, I planted, Apollos watered, God gave the increase.
Right.
Yeah, and it wasn't on or Paul, neither Paul nor Apollos' missionary tactics or plans or whatever.
Right.
it was
Right.
God, and obviously Paul wasn't able to be there and hold the hands of all of the people whom he brought to Jesus, or all the congregations that he
Right.
helped to form in the various locations throughout the New Testament world.
Right.
However, he still said, uh, the cares of the churches weighed on his mind on a regular basis.
Yes, and he spent a lot of time, even in prison, writing letters to
Right.
correct and to offer spiritual guidance. And
Yes.
I am not in any way saying that Barton and I are Pauline, but we kind of feel that burden.
Mhm.
All of us do that are former missionaries there, and
Right.
even this week we had a Zoom call with our ministers down there to support them. And so
Yeah,
Cusco will always be part of us.
absolutely. And, by the way, toward that end, I've had plenty of Zoom meetings with, minister friends to try and help me navigate the difficulties that is, ministry
Yes.
during a COVID era, or just ministry during any era.
Right. Absolutely.
I need that
Absolutely.
support.
And I want to talk a little bit about that in a couple minutes here, but
Mhm.
absolutely. Absolutely.
So, you mentioned earlier, sharing life in the midst and across different cultures, not only to impart whatever you have to offer to them, but also for them to offer things that can help you. What do you want the American church to hear regarding, the work of missions or the needs of mission works today? And I'm asking you that obviously
Sure.
because of the experience that you have laboring there in Cusco for the period of time that you did.
Yeah. And I don't know if this is the direction I should go with this, but this is the one that came to mind.
Good.
So think, you know, you were at your own risk putting an open-ended question to me, right? So one of the first phrase that comes to mind, and I think is overlooked a lot and this isn't just within the churches of Christ. I think this is across the board. It can be the case, but missionary care. And most
Mm,
people
yeah.
have either not even heard of that term or don't think about it, or it sounds kind of nebulous. So I'll try to put a little bit of make it a little bit more concrete, but just as church leaders, and I know a lot of the audience are ministers, hopefully deacons and elders as well, others that are leading in different ministries, people on missions committees as well. I would just say, please make sure that your missionaries are more than a dot on a missions map
Mm,
and a line item on the budget. Um,
mhm.
it's very easy, and I think one of my friends, I believe Chad Garrett, who
Oh,
has done
yeah.
so much mission work. He's down there just south of Charlotte right now, and he talks about the mutual fund approach to supporting missionaries. That can often be the case, where instead of one church or a couple of churches supporting a couple or a missionary to go down to the foreign field, fully, you've got to go around and, at the maximum, we had 13 to 15 churches that supported us on a monthly basis. And so, some of those churches like Estes were very big supporters, and not just financially, but spiritually as well. But there were several of those churches, not for bad intentions, but when you only send $50 or $100 a month, there's just not a lot of connection there. And
Yeah.
so it's that much easier for it to be kind of an anonymous relationship, and for that missionary's livelihood to be pulled for another project at the local church when that relationship isn't there. So make sure to get to know your missionaries personally. Pray for them constantly and specifically, like you would a friend, like you would somebody in the local church. And to your point a minute ago, what you said you needed and what I need is exactly what missionaries need as well, as a support system.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of missionaries go down with a Bible in their hands and a prayer, and God can do all things. But God works normally through other children of His to be those tools. And so, please, elderships, missions committees, have relationships. I mean, the elders are not just shepherds of the local congregation. They need to shepherd the missionaries that they send as well. They need to be the spiritual mentors, support system for them.
Mm-hmm.
Make sure your missionaries are connected with other missionaries, just like anybody in any field of work needs others who have similar contexts and experiences to share difficulties, frustrations, successes, failures. Missionaries need the same thing. Spiritual mentorship, again, is just so huge. I think that Satan's attacks can come more frequently and in stronger ways whenever somebody is living in a foreign context and they're under all the added pressure. I just don't think a lot of people in the United States or in the sending country realize that your missionary is not just doing their work in another place, but they're constantly having to deal with like increased mental fatigue from working all day in their second language, and from in Peru, we always talked about Peruvian time in a joking way. It could take
Mm-hmm.
all morning for me to just go and do a simple transaction at the bank that most people in the United States could take care of from an app on their phone. And so for a type A person, a planner like me who wants to get a certain amount of stuff done a day, and then to
Yeah.
just hit that roadblock, and there's just so many of those little things that I guess drain your resources quicker in a lot of contexts. That makes it a lot easier for the enemy's attacks to hit and for temptation. And so make sure your missionaries are supported. Moral failure is a big thing in ministry in general,
Mm-hmm.
in missions as well. Those kind of temptations, make sure your missionaries have you're taking care and tending to them as individuals, their marriages, their families. If you can get them connected with some organization like Great Cities or Missions Resource Network or some other that specializes in that as well, Missionary Care would be wonderful. I did want to say this too, just proactively find ways to care for them, not just care packages, although those are wonderful. But it would have been wonderful if on occasion, a missionary who comes back home and people think, oh, you get an entire month or 2 months off from work every year to come back and just, sit around in your house during your
Right.
furlough. Normally it was Sunday morning class, Sunday night in a different location, Wednesday night in a different location. So it was like 4 or 5 different visits a week in different places. We had congregations in different states. And so furloughs were not at all a vacation. And we're trying to pack an entire year's worth of time with family into a couple weeks with one family, a couple weeks with the other family. So send your missionaries off for a weekend when they come back on furlough.
Mm.
Arrange childcare. Send them to a retreat center, or send them to a bed and breakfast somewhere. Give them permission not to be on for a while. Give them permission not to make additional reports or all of those kind of things. Or and I know that not all churches have those expectations for their missionaries. A lot of times you feel like as a missionary you have to make those regular reports to, to
Hmm.
maintain your support and to deepen relationships with those churches. But go out of the box. Think of ways to pamper them and take care of them, because they are doing, a hard thing very far away from home and family and their normal support system. So
Yeah. Wow.
um yeah, so
No,
there's part of it.
no, and this is really good.
Right.
I'm grateful for how practical and down to earth this is. So often, it's like, well, churches know, okay, we in October we have a missions emphasis and we bring in as many missionaries as we can, get
Right.
stateside or in our general area. Or, they'll say, well, it's time for this report again. And, the congregation may think, oh, these are all the same. They're going to show
Right.
us pictures in a slide deck and uh,
Well, and
we're
it
all
can be that way, but
yeah, sure, absolutely. But I guess this sort of gets routine to us, and we get in kind of a rut with it, and we're not, and maybe even from the perspective of congregational leadership, it can get to, well, we had some room in the budget for this, and so we've got this. We added it to the back page of the bulletin that nobody really ever reads.
right.
And we're going to bring him in, whenever he's in town, and see if he'll preach for us one Sunday a year or whatever. And it
Yeah.
never goes beyond that. And really, there's no reason why it has to remain that way.
Right.
And
Right.
especially in days like this, one of our elders was recently in Africa, and the secretary here was texting back and forth with his wife, who was also on the trip with him. And she said, "Isn't this amazing? I'm just texting someone who's in Africa right now."
Right.
And the reality is, it's never been easier to connect. But as we so often discuss, as we bemoan first world problems,
Yeah.
we're not often utilizing the technology in ways that really make meaningful connections with people.
Sure. And the burden of responsibility for those connections is not just on local leadership. I do think
Sure,
elders and missions committees need to be proactive with it. But I know I found myself sometimes, with Estes being our overseeing church, I could easily sit there and say, man, I wish they'd reach out more. I wish they would do this. But they are shepherding multiple mission points and those kind
sure.
of things.
Mhm.
I need to go out and ask for that. And no one's going to force spiritual mentorship on you, right? You have to
Yeah,
be open
yeah,
to it and seek it and that support system. So it's reciprocal, but I do think the burden of responsibility needs to be taken more on the local church to
right.
view themselves not as the funders of missionaries, but genuinely the senders that
Yes.
are a vital function of that mission work as the senders.
Hmm.
Um, One thing that I wanted to add real quick, and I touched on this
Yeah.
earlier, just another thing I'd love for the local church to do more of, again, is to treat your missionaries well, but don't treat them like superheroes. They're
Mm,
not. They're normal people. They may have followed God to serve in a place that's not their home, but they're still human. They have flaws. They're walking by faith, and a lot of mission work, as it is in ministry in general, is trial and error. Um, and so, there are two problems. This came from an article that actually a former teammate of mine, Skylar Johnston, just shared with us. She's actually stayed with us the last couple of nights on her way through back to Henderson. She's heading your way right now, Robert. But
oh, great.
yeah, so she shared an article about a person that was a missionary. He writes a blog about life overseas and talks about the two problems with treating missionaries and superheroes is that the missionaries feel the pressure to live up to that title and to take
Mm,
it all on themselves. But the other part of it is that if you always think of your missionaries as these super people or these, out of the ordinary outliers, if you will, then that creates this psychological distance between a local church member and somebody who's a missionary.
mm,
A distance that doesn't deserve to be there, and it puts people up on the pedestal and think, "Oh, I could never do something like they're doing, or I
yeah.
could never dream of doing that." And it puts missionaries or ministers in this class of people they don't deserve to be in. But it also just feeds this mindset of, I'm not cut out for that. I'm a local church member. I'm here in my home area. I can never evangelize like they do. I can never do any of these things, and so it almost gives a crutch for people. Not painting bad intentions, but it can give a crutch for people to not live on mission where they are,
Right.
or not to consider, going into a foreign field.
Mhm. Mhm. That's a good point. Wow. All right, let's flip the script a little bit and talk to the people who are ministering, laboring for the kingdom, men and women in some place other than, where their homeland is. What
Sure.
what do you want to say to those people who may be listening or watching today?
Yeah. The first thing is, if people are in that position today, and you touched on this earlier, acknowledge the difficulties that you've gone through for the past 2 years.
Mm,
Acknowledge that and allow the things that God has hopefully shown you, if you weren't aware of them before. You know, Weaknesses in your life, in your family, any of those kind of things that this pandemic has highlighted, like it has for so many of us. Acknowledge those things. Acknowledge the difficulties of living and working far from home, far from family, culture, your native language, and without going into any practical ways of doing this, give those up to God as much as possible and share them openly with others. Be vulnerable with others. System. Seek out your elders back in the church, spiritual mentors, counselors, the missions organizations. Seek out your support system. Take responsibility for your own spiritual welfare. And don't, as is the case with any minister anywhere, but don't let your ministry for God take place, or get in the way of your relationship with God.
mm,
Um,
mhm,
and then the final thing I would just say is, don't let the place that you serve in or the work that you're serving in become your identity. And I touched
mm,
on this a little bit earlier. Your identity is a child of God, just like everyone else's who's come to Christ. And your calling is to be his servant wherever he has called you. Um, I had to do a lot of hard work in separating my identity from being a missionary to Cusco, Peru,
mm.
from being a missionary, and from a lot of other aspects. I had to kind of peel back the layers of some of those things, and realize, no, my identity is absolutely that I am known and loved by God.
Mm,
And whenever your identity shifts from God to anything else, it's just, it never leads to a good place. And so, stay strong where you are, but make sure to do the right thing for your family. The place where you are, God may want you to be there long term, but do be open to Him calling you somewhere else when the time is right. And especially in a church planting missions context, always try to make sure that you're equipping local people to do the work rather than doing the ministry yourself.
mm,
Um, and always uh, keep that urgency of being there temporarily in mind, and let that kind of guide what you do and what you don't do. And remember, like, Robert, you quoted a minute ago from First Corinthians, it's God that gives the increase.
mhm,
You're a planter, you're a waterer, whatever your role, your calling is, God's going to give the increase. So even though it may seem like with pandemic or other scandals in the church or difficulties on
mm.
the field that the world may be falling apart, it's not.
Yeah.
Um, and it's not falling apart because of your choices necessarily, or your presence there, or your absence there. God's still in control. It's His work. It always has been, always will be. So take heart in that as well.
Mm. Wow. I love that. Thank you for sharing those things. And I think that uh, everything you said is something that all of us as preachers and ministers, no matter where we're serving, just need to hear and consider. Everything from, finding our identity in our work or ministry, to just being open and honest, maybe perhaps chiefly with ourselves, about everything that the last 2 years has been.
Right.
And in many
Right.
ways, it continues to be. And
Sure.
I think that's freeing. Thanks so much. Ryan Davis is in Nashville, Tennessee, with the Bellevue congregation there. And if you're in the Nashville area, passing through or whatever, I'm sure that the fine folks over there would be happy to see you. I
Yeah.
know that Ryan would be as well. Hey, by the way, you mentioned a minute ago, Chad Garrett. I've had Chad on the podcast too. He talked
Oh,
about
look at that.
ministering to a church plant in a new community, and
Yeah.
we
Down
talked
in
a lot
Indian
about
land.
that. Yeah, over there in Indian Land. That was April of 2021. So a
Yeah.
little bit more into the pandemic stuff, and Chad talked a lot about that back then as well. We'll
Sure.
put a link to that in our show notes also. By the way, you can find all those show notes at thelightnetwork.tv. Search for this episode, Preachers in Training Season 15, Episode 5. And you can also find all of our episode archives there. Season 15 implies that there are 14 preceding seasons, and that would be an accurate implication. So go and check those out. I think that you'll enjoy it. I love to hear from you. Preachers at thelightnetwork.tv is how you can get in touch with me. If you've got episode ideas or comments, you want to share your perspectives on things, I'd love to hear that. The Facebook group is also a wonderful place in which you can connect, not just with me, but with a lot of other listeners. We have 500 or 600 people that are in that group right now, and we really try hard to keep it tailored to discussions on preaching and ministry. And so if you're on Facebook, search for Preachers in Training, you'll find the group. It's a closed group. But if you, request to be admitted into the group, we'll be happy for you to be a part of that. Subscribe if you enjoy the podcast in your favorite podcast app. Just search Preachers in Training or The Light Network, or on YouTube as well. Same thing applies. And that way you can listen or watch without ever missing an episode. Brand new episodes release on Thursdays from thelightnetwork.tv. Ryan Davis, thank you, brother. We appreciate your time today. Appreciate your insights. Appreciate the work that you did and continue to do. It's just great to reconnect with you today, man.
It's been great to see you as well. And I thank you for what you're doing for all of these people that are serving in all of
Oh,
these
thanks.
places. And I pray that that audience continues to grow, and God can continue to open new pathways for you to be able to just have these honest conversations that
Yeah,
everyone needs to hear from. So thank
I
you.
appreciate
I'm
that.
praying for you and Emily and the kids, and for your work in Henderson there.
Yeah, thanks a lot. And thanks to all of you for being a part of this week's episode of Preachers in Training. Hope you'll join us next week. But until then, I'm Robert Hatfield. Let's go preach the word.